Directional influence, or better known as DI, is something very unique to the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. It's not something you really have to worry about any other fighter. The reason I'm creating this video is to help you guys understand exactly how DI works in Smash 4 and how to optimize your DI as best as you can. But before we actually talk about DI, we have to first establish what it actually means to get hit in this game. Every time you get hit by something in this game, it has knockback. Knockback can be seen as a velocity. Velocity is both something that has direction and magnitude. And what I mean by magnitude is actually just how far you get launched. And of course, magnitude has many variables. How high your percent is, the range of your opponent. There's also, for example, if it's a smash attack, how long they charged it. So magnitude is just that, how far the hit launched you. So now that we established that every knockback has velocity, we can quantify these velocities by using vectors. Vectors are line segments that have both magnitude and direction that people use to do different calculations with velocities. That is actually how I see knockback in this game. Whenever I get hit, I see it as a vector. It's something that has both magnitude and direction. And when I DI, I see it as another vector, because that's exactly what it is. When you are DIing, you're using a vector that you create that can help manipulate how you get launched, so you can increase your survivability. So this right here is a demonstration that I like to use a lot whenever I'm explaining DI to someone that's getting into competitive Smash. So what you're seeing right now are the blast zones and a vector that's showing you a knockback. As you can see from the image, if you don't do anything, this is going to kill you. The vector is extending past the blast zone. However, if you DI this correctly, you can make it so the knockback is, or the vector in this case, is not extending past the blast zone anymore, which means that you're surviving. This is exactly how DI works at its very basic level. However, there is something very important that I have to establish, and it's probably going to be the foundation of this video. And it's that you cannot affect the magnitude that you're being launched. You can only affect the direction that you're being launched. So for example, if you get up thrown by a Mewtwo and you hold down, which is exactly the opposite direction that you're being launched, you're not doing anything. Well, I mean, actually you are doing something, and it's called LSI, but for the purposes of this video, you're not doing anything. The most optimal thing to do when you're getting up thrown by a Mewtwo is to hold left or right. And you're probably thinking, okay, I knew that already. That's actually something that's common knowledge. If you hold against the direction that you're being launched, you're not actually doing anything. But the reason why I'm establishing that is because that is a very important detail for when we're talking about diagonal vectors, which gets a little bit complicated. So a diagonal vector is actually a combination of two vectors. And this is how you have to see it. When you think of a diagonal vector, you have to think of it as a vector that has both an x component and a y component. So for example, this vector right here has both an x component and a y component that when you add up, it gives you this final direction and magnitude. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting, and we're going to go ahead and use a horizontal knockback as our first example to kind of help demonstrate exactly what it means to have a diagonal vector in play. So let's say that for this horizontal knockback, you DI'd diagonally. Now remember, when you do a diagonal DI, or if you have a diagonal vector, you have both an x component and a y component. You also have to remember that you cannot affect the magnitude of a knockback. So for this diagonal vector, because it has an x component and a y component, the x component is actually not doing anything. The x component is trying to manipulate the knockback's magnitude, which as we established, you can't do. So the only thing that's coming into play is actually the y component. And notice the y component is a little bit smaller because it's diagonal. Now notice this, if we're to DI the horizontal knockback exactly up, we're getting the maximum amount of y that we can. We're getting the maximum amount of distance on the y-axis that we can. So because of it, if you're to DI exactly perpendicular to the knockback, you're getting the maximum amount of distance that you can get out of it. That is why you usually hear that you want to DI a knockback perpendicular to where it launches you, and this is exactly the reason why. It's because you get the maximum amount of distance out of it. And 90% of the times, that's the right way you want to DI. You want to DI exactly perpendicular to how you get launched. And with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and give you an example. Try to see what would be the most optimal way to DI this knockback. So which one would be the most optimal way to DI this knockback? If you were listening to what I was saying, you would probably be inclined to say this one right here, which is exactly perpendicular. And remember what I said, 90% of the times, yes, the perpendicular DI would be the most optimal DI. However, not in this case. Notice that if we DI exactly perpendicular to the knockback, there's an issue. Because if we are to DI exactly perpendicular, now we can pass the corner and hit the blast zone, now not from the ceiling, but from the wall. So this is where it becomes an issue. You have to decide how much you actually want to go that way so that you aim exactly for the corner of the blast zone and not hit the wall instead of the ceiling. By the way, to solve this problem, I advise you to recalibrate the x-axis so that the knockback is standing exactly on the x-axis. You're not actually doing anything, you're not actually changing the problem, you're not changing any of the numbers, you're just changing the way you see it so that you can better visualize the x component and the y component of your DI. Notice how this DI, although it has a very big x component, it doesn't really have a big y component. And remember, it doesn't matter how big or small the x component is, that doesn't actually change the magnitude that you're being launched. So notice how the y component is very small, and because of it, that's the way you want to DI this knockback. Having a very small y component ensures you that you don't go too much so that you DI all the way to the wall. You DI just a little bit so that for the very possibility that you don't overextend. And that's exactly how it works to try to see what is the most optimal way to DI. Do you want to get maximum distance? Alright, DI perpendicular. Do you want to DI but not really get the maximum amount of distance? Then you start DIing in a very diagonal way so that you get a very small y component, because the y component is what matters. And we have now reached the end of the video. I hope that this video can serve you as a guide to optimize your DI. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you the next time.